Number 1. Keith Hunter Jesperson. Two innocent people were sitting in Oregon prison cells, convicted of a murder they did not commit. And the real killer? He was still out there, driving his truck, crossing state lines, and smiling about it. That is where this story begins. Keith Hunter Jesperson was born on April 6, 1955, in Chilliwack, British Columbia, a small town just north of the Washington state border. From the outside, he seemed unremarkable. But inside his home, something was deeply wrong. His father was a domineering alcoholic, and the household was defined by fear. Keith, the middle child of 5, learned early that the powerful hurt the powerless, and nobody stopped them. By school age, classmates noticed something unsettling about him. His towering height made him a target for ridicule, and earning him the nickname Igor. He grew into a brooding, volatile teenager, prone to outbursts and isolation. Away from the schoolyard, he began harming animals, not impulsively, but with what investigators later described as deliberate detachment. His daughter Melissa would later recall witnessing her father hang stray kittens from the clothesline. When she returned with help, they were already dead. It was not random cruelty. It was practice. Jesperson eventually married, had 3 children, and settled in Cheney, Washington. He found steady work as a long-haul trucker, a job that put him behind the wheel of an 18-wheeler and sent him crisscrossing the country for weeks at a time. His marriage deteriorated, and by 1990, his wife had filed for divorce. The divorce was finalized the same year Jesperson committed his first murder. On January 21, 1990, he met a 23-year-old woman named Tanya Bennett at a bar near Portland. Bennett, who lived with an intellectual disability, accepted his invitation back to his rental house. What happened that night ended with Bennett dead, her body discovered near the Columbia River Gorge. Jesperson had strangled her. Then the case took a turn. A local woman named Laverne Pavlinak, desperate to escape an abusive relationship, fabricated a confession using details from news coverage, implicating her boyfriend, John Sosnovsky. Investigators were convinced. Both were convicted. 2 people went to prison for a murder they did not commit. And Jesperson kept driving. Over the next 5 years, he killed at least 7 more women across 6 states. Then his victims were predominantly transient women, whose disappearances did not immediately trigger large-scale investigations. He strangled each one, describing it later as something that gave him a sense of control. But Jesperson had a need that would be his undoing. He needed to be known. Furious that Pavlinak and Sosnovsky were receiving attention for his crime, he began sending messages. He scrawled a confession on a Montana truck stop bathroom wall, signing it with a smiley face. When authorities dismissed it, he escalated, sending a 6-page handwritten letter to the Oregonian detailing the murders with specifics only the true killer could know. Reporter Phil Stanford connected the graffiti to the letter and gave the writer a name, the Happy Face Killer. His capture came through his final victim and his own ego. In March 1995, he strangled his girlfriend Julianne Winningham near Washougal, Washington. Unlike his previous victims, she had a documented relationship with him. Investigators found the connection quickly. Days after initial questioning, Jesperson wrote a letter to his brother, confessing to everything. His brother handed it directly to law enforcement. Laverne Pavlinak and John Sosnovsky, who had spent nearly 6 years in prison, were immediately released. Jesperson pleaded guilty to 3 murders and accepted life in prison to avoid the death penalty. Sentenced to 6 consecutive and concurrent life sentences totaling 120 years. In 2010, he received a 4th life sentence in California for a 1992 murder. As recently as 2024, investigators were still working to formally identify that victim using forensic genetic genealogy. Today, a Jesperson sits inside Oregon State Penitentiary in Salem. He will not be eligible for parole until 2063, when he would be 108 years old. Number 2. Diane Downs. She drove to the hospital at 5 miles per hour. Her daughter was already dead in the back seat, and when the nurses asked what happened, she told them about a stranger with shaggy hair. That detail, 5 miles per hour, is where the entire case begins to unravel. Elizabeth Diane Downs was born on August 7, 1955, in Phoenix, Arizona. She grew up bright, energetic, and intensely focused on herself, a pattern that would define nearly every relationship she ever had. She married young, had 3 children, Christy, Cheryl, and Danny, and took a job as a letter carrier with the United States Postal Service. From the outside, she was a working mother doing her best. But Diane Downs had a consuming need for male attention. By the early 1980s, she had relocated to Springfield, Oregon, to be closer to a married former coworker named Robert Knickerbocker, with whom she had developed an obsessive fixation. Knickerbocker had made his position clear. He did not want children. He wanted nothing to do with her kids. Investigators would later argue those words became a death sentence. On the evening of May 19, 1983, Downs loaded her 3 children into the car after dark. At approximately 10:48 that night, she pulled into the emergency bay at Mackenzie Willamette Hospital in Springfield. All 3 children had been shot at close range with a .22 caliber weapon. 7-year-old Cheryl was pronounced dead at the scene. Christy, 8, had suffered a massive stroke from blood loss. Danny, just 3, May had been shot in the chest. Downs herself had a minor gunshot wound to her left forearm, notably the arm she would have used least if she had fired the weapon herself. Her story was immediate and detailed. A shaggy-haired stranger had stepped out of the darkness on a remote road, demanded her car, and when she refused, shot her children. She was composed, articulate, and talking a lot. That last detail struck Detective Doug Welch of the Lane County Sheriff's Office immediately. Downs wasn't behaving like a traumatized mother. She was almost performative, loud when cameras were present, flat when they weren't. Within weeks, with Christy and Danny still in hospital beds, she had given multiple media interviews, proclaiming her innocence with an enthusiasm that unsettled everyone watching. But the physical evidence didn't support her story. No tire tracks, no footprints, no evidence of a second vehicle. The bullet trajectories didn't align with someone shooting from outside the car. Witnesses reported her vehicle moving toward the hospital at 5 to 7 miles per hour, directly contradicting her claim that she had raced there in a panic. When investigators searched her home, they found cartridges with extractor markings matching the weapon used in the shooting, a weapon never recovered. Then came the diaries. Page after page detailed her fixation on Knickerbocker, the man who would not be with a woman who had children. The prosecution argued she had drawn a straight line between that conversation and the night of May 19th. And then came Christy. Through painstaking sessions with therapists and investigators, the older daughter recovered enough to communicate what she remembered. It did not include a shaggy-haired stranger. It included her mother. Police arrested Diane Downs on February 28, 1984. Her trial began in May. She arrived in court visibly pregnant, widely interpreted as a calculated bid for jury sympathy. The jury was not moved. They returned a verdict of guilty. Murder in the first degree for Cheryl, and 2 counts of attempted murder for Christy and Danny. The sentence was life in prison plus 50 years. The baby, named Amy Elizabeth, was immediately taken by the state. She was later renamed Becky Babcock. 3 years into her sentence, Downs escaped, scaling a razor wire fence and evading capture for 10 days before being found blocks from the prison. She received an additional 5 years and was transferred to a maximum security facility in New Jersey. In December 2025, the Oregon Board of Parole denied her release again, citing an ongoing mental or emotional disorder that predisposes her to criminal behavior. She still maintains her innocence, as she has for more than 40 years. Christy and Danny Downs survived. They were adopted by the lead prosecutor on their mother's case, Fred Hughey, and his wife. Number 3, Randall Woodfield. With the 428th pick in the 1974 NFL Draft, the Green Bay Packers selected one of the most dangerous men in American history. Nobody in that room knew it yet. Randall Brent Woodfield was born on December 26, 1950 in Salem, Oregon, and raised in the small seaside town of Otter Rock on the Oregon coast. His father was a senior executive at Pacific Northwest Bell. His 2 older sisters went on to become a doctor and an attorney. The Woodfield family was well regarded and deeply respectable, and Randy was the golden boy. At Newport High School, he played football, basketball, and ran track. He was popular, good-looking, and blessed with an athlete's natural ease around people. What those around him did not know was that beneath the athletic polish, something had already gone badly wrong. As young as 11, Woodfield had begun engaging in acts of indecent exposure. His first formal arrest came while he was still in high school, caught exposing himself to a group of girls on a local bridge. His coaches quietly suppressed the incident. His juvenile record was expunged at 18. Randy Woodfield moved on to college with a clean slate and a deep, unaddressed problem. At Portland State University, he played wide receiver and continued to attract NFL attention, but the arrests followed. Public indecency charges in Washington State and Multnomah County. Each time, football created enough insulation to keep the consequences manageable. In 1974, the Green Bay Packers selected him in the 17th round of the NFL Draft. But Woodfield could not make the final roster. He was cut during training camp without playing a single regular season game. He spent 1 season with the semi-pro Manitowoc Chiefs in Wisconsin before that door closed too. Then he came home to Oregon. Within a year of returning to Portland, he began attacking women, robbing them at knife point. Portland police eventually caught him through a sting operation. He pleaded guilty to second-degree robbery in 1975 and was sentenced to 10 years. He was released on parole after just 4 years. 15 months after walking out of prison, Woodfield attended his 10-year high school reunion and reconnected with a former classmate named Cherie Ayers. On October 9, 1980, Ayers was found beaten, stabbed, and sexually assaulted in her apartment. She was dead. She was his first confirmed murder victim. Over the next 5 months, Woodfield moved up and down Interstate 5, hitting targets in Washington, Oregon, and Northern California with accelerating frequency. He wore a hoodie, a fake beard, and a strip of athletic tape across his nose. He targeted women working alone at the end of shifts, gas stations, convenience stores, in office buildings. He robbed them, assaulted them, and in a growing number of cases, killed them. On January 18, 1981, 20-year-old Sherry Hull was finishing a cleaning shift at a Transamerica office building in Kaiser, Oregon. She and a coworker named Beth Wilmot were preparing to leave when Woodfield entered. Hull was killed. Wilmot, shot in the head, survived, and that survival would become the most important development in the entire investigation. Detective Dave Komanek of the Marion County Sheriff's Office had already identified Woodfield as his primary suspect. Payphone records showed he had placed calls using calling cards near murder sites around the exact times the crimes were committed. He had essentially signed his name to the timeline. On March 5, 1981, Beth Wilmot picked Woodfield's photograph out of a lineup. That's 2 days later, a search of his apartment turned up a spent point .32 caliber shell casing and a roll of tape-matching tape recovered from crime scenes. He was taken into custody on March 7, 1981. The jury found him guilty of murder and attempted murder. He was sentenced to life plus 90 years. A second trial added another 35 years for additional charges. DNA testing in 2001 and 2006 connected him to additional murders. In 2012, forensic advances linked him to 5 more killings, including a mother and her 14-year-old daughter killed in their California home in February 1981. Investigators have linked Woodfield to as many as 44 homicides. He has never confessed to a single murder. He remains at Oregon State Penitentiary in Salem, where release is a mathematical impossibility. Number 4. Ma Anand Sheila. In the autumn of 1984, the people of the Dalles, Oregon sat down to lunch. They had no idea that someone had already been in those restaurants before them. This is not a story about a serial killer. It is the story of how a spiritual movement turned a quiet stretch of rural Oregon into the site of the largest bioterrorist attack in American history. Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh was an Indian mystic who by the late 1970s had amassed a global following built on meditation, free love, and the rejection of conventional society. His followers wore robes of red and orange, took spiritual names, and devoted themselves entirely to his teachings. He operated almost entirely through an inner circle of devoted lieutenants. The most powerful of those lieutenants was Sheila Ambalal Patel, born in India on December 28, 1949, that is, who took the name Ma Anand Sheila. Sharp, ambitious, and utterly fearless in front of a camera, Sheila rose to become Rajneesh's personal secretary and, for all practical purposes, the operational commander of his entire organization. In 1981, Sheila convinced Rajneesh to relocate to the United States. The Rajneesh Foundation purchased a 64,000-acre ranch in Wasco County, Oregon, a remote expanse of high desert known as the Big Muddy Ranch. Within months, thousands of followers had relocated there. Roads were paved, buildings constructed, and a town with its own post office, police force, airport, and airline took shape almost overnight. They named it Rajneeshpuram. The neighboring town of Antelope, a conservative ranching community of roughly 40 residents, watched with growing alarm. Sheila rarely passed up an opportunity to antagonize the locals, at one point naming a landfill next to Antelope's church the Adolf Hitler garbage dump. Relations between the commune and Wasco County deteriorated into open hostility. By 1984, the commune faced mounting legal challenges, denied building permits, immigration fraud investigations, and scrutiny from the Oregon Attorney General. Sheila's solution was to seize political control of Wasco County by winning 2 seats on the county court in the November 1984 election. The problem was numbers. The voters of the Dalles overwhelmingly opposed the commune. No realistic combination of Rajneeshi voters could overcome that margin. And so Sheila posed a question to her inner circle. What if those voters simply could not get to the polls? The answer was Salmonella typhimurium, And under Sheila's direction, a small team began culturing the bacteria in a makeshift laboratory inside Rajneeshpuram, using a sample ordered from a medical supply company in Seattle. Between September 9th and 17th, 1984, commune members entered 10 restaurants in the Dalles and quietly introduced the bacteria into the salad bars. On September 25th, residents began falling ill: stomach cramps, fever, vomiting, severe diarrhea. Within days, cases numbered in the hundreds. The CDC dispatched investigators who attributed the outbreak to poor restaurant hygiene. 751 people were confirmed infected. 45 were hospitalized. No one died, but the margin was narrower than it appeared. The attack did not achieve its objective, though local residents turned out in higher numbers than expected and voted overwhelmingly against the Rajneeshi candidates. The commune's collapse came swiftly. By September 1985, Rajneesh himself called a press conference accusing Sheila and her inner circle of wiretapping, arson, attempted murder, and the Salmonella attack. He called them a gang of fascists. Sheila had already fled to Europe. She was arrested in West Germany and extradited to the United States. Investigators found laboratory records documenting the bacteria cultures and Salmonella samples, whose profile exactly matched those recovered from the sick patients in the Dalles. In July 1986, Sheila pleaded guilty to first-degree assault, attempted murder, arson, immigration fraud, and wiretapping. She was sentenced to 3 concurrent 20-year terms and fined $470,000. She was released after just 29 months and deported. Sheila has lived in Switzerland for decades, managing 2 nursing homes. She has appeared in 2 Netflix documentaries and continues to deny ordering the Salmonella attack. The Oregon Attorney General called it the most significant series of crimes of their kind in American history, all engineered from a commune in the high desert of Wasco County, in pursuit of 2 seats on a county court. Number 5, Christian Longo. While his children's bodies were still underwater off the Oregon coast, he was on a beach in Mexico, scuba diving, meeting women, telling everyone his name was Michael Finkel. That detail, the name he chose, is the thread that unravels everything. Christian Michael Longo was born on January 23, 1974, in Ypsilanti Township, Michigan, into a family of devout Jehovah's Witnesses. His upbringing was structured, religious, and defined by the congregation. It was at church, in a parking lot, that a 19-year-old Christian first encountered Mary Jane Baker, who was 26. They married in 1993. Over the next several years, they had 3 children: Zachary, Sadie, and Madison. To anyone looking at the family from the outside, they appeared to be exactly what they presented themselves as: a young, dedicated couple raising their children in faith, navigating life together with patience and quiet determination. But Christian Longo was not what he appeared to be. He had never been what he appeared to be. Beneath the surface of the devoted husband and father was a compulsive liar and a chronic thief. Longo stole money from employers. He wrote bad checks. He fabricated stories about his career and income to keep his family from understanding how dire their financial situation truly was. For a period, he worked managing distribution for a company that handled New York Times newspaper deliveries. And it was there, reading the bylines on those articles, that he developed a particular admiration for one journalist, a writer named Michael Finkel. The name would surface again, in a way nobody could have predicted. By 2001, the walls were closing in. The Longo family had been evicted from their home in Ohio and relocated to Newport, Oregon, a coastal town in Lincoln County, where Christian found work at a local Starbucks, while Mary Jane cared for their 3 young children. They lived in a rented apartment near Yaquina Bay. The debts followed them west. The lies had become too large to contain. And on the evening of December 16, 2001, Christian Longo stood on the balcony of that apartment, looking out over the water, knowing they were about to be evicted again, and said later that this night was, in his own words, the beginning of the end. What happened next unfolded over the course of several hours. That night, records indicate, Longo strangled his wife Mary Jane inside their apartment. He then strangled their 2-year-old daughter Madison. He placed both bodies into suitcases, weighted them down with dumbbells, loaded them into his car, and drove to Yaquina Bay. He then collected his 2 remaining children, 4-year-old Zachary and 3-year-old Sadie, who had been sleeping. He drove to the Lint Slough Bridge over the Alsea River, where he tied pillowcases filled with rocks around the legs of both children and dropped them from the bridge into the dark water below. He then returned to the bay and disposed of the suitcases containing Mary Jane and Madison. And then, with extraordinary calm, he began constructing a new life. On December 19, 2001, 3 days after the murders, a small child's body surfaced in Lint Slough. It was Zachary Longo, 4 years old. Divers were dispatched and located Sadie's body still submerged, tethered to the bottom by the rock-filled pillowcase. 8 days later, on December 27th, divers found 2 suitcases floating near the Longo apartment in Yaquina Bay. Inside were Mary Jane, 34 years old, with bruising consistent with strangulation around her neck, and 2-year-old Madison, weighted down with a dumbbell. Yet Christian Longo was nowhere. The FBI placed him on the 10 most wanted list within 24 hours. He had already fled the country. Using a stolen credit card number, he had purchased a plane ticket to Cancun, Mexico, and he had chosen a name to travel under, the name he had read on those newspaper articles for years. He told everyone he was Michael Finkel, journalist, New York Times writer, researcher of Mayan ruins for an upcoming travel feature. The real Michael Finkel, at that precise moment, was in the middle of his own professional catastrophe. The New York Times magazine had just discovered that Finkel had fabricated the central subject of a major investigative piece he had written on modern-day slavery. He was fired. His reputation was destroyed. And in what might be the single most bizarre coincidence in American true crime history, the man who had stolen his identity was simultaneously living as him in Mexico, spinning adventure stories to a German photographer and bar-hopping along the Yucatan coast. On December 27, 2001, the same day Mary Jane and Madison were found, an American tourist at a hotel near Cancun recognized Longo from news reports circulating back home. Mexican authorities placed him under surveillance. What they observed over the following weeks was a man utterly unburdened by what he had done. He was socializing, swimming, meeting people. When agents finally moved in on January 14, 2002, they found him in his cabana, unclothed, in the company of the German photographer. He was arrested and extradited to the United States. At George Bush Intercontinental Airport in Houston, Longo was taken into federal custody. When asked about his family by investigators, he reportedly said simply, he had sent them to a better place. His trial began on March 10, 2003. The defense strategy was as calculated as the crime itself. Longo pleaded not guilty initially, then modified his position, acknowledging that he had killed Mary Jane and Madison, but claiming that in a rage triggered by financial desperation, his wife had first killed Zachary and Sadie. He positioned himself not as a predator, but as a broken man who had reacted to an unthinkable act by his wife. The prosecution dismantled this version methodically, presenting the physical evidence, the timeline of the murders, and the sheer logistical impossibility of the story Longo was telling. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours, guilty on all 4 counts, sentenced to death by lethal injection. The case did not end at sentencing. What followed was one of the most unusual relationships in true crime journalism. The real Michael Finkel, fascinated and disturbed by the man who had stolen his identity, flew to Oregon to meet Longo face to face. Over the next year, the two exchanged more than 1,000 pages of letters and spoke by telephone regularly. Longo fed Finkel multiple versions of events, each confession slightly different, each one calibrated, investigators believed, to test how far Finkel could be manipulated. In 2005, Finkel published his account of the relationship in a memoir titled True Story, Murder, Memoir, Mea Culpa. In 2015, it became a Hollywood film, all with James Franco playing Longo and Jonah Hill playing Finkel. In 2011, Longo gave an interview in which he finally admitted, fully, to killing his entire family. He described making the decision while at work that day, concluding that the pressure of their circumstances had become unbearable, and that he was, again in his own words, sending them somewhere better. In December 2022, Oregon Governor Kate Brown commuted the death sentences of everyone on the state's death row, converting each to life without the possibility of parole. Christian Longo is currently incarcerated at the Oregon State Penitentiary in Salem. He has spent years advocating for a policy that would allow death row prisoners to donate their organs after execution, a campaign some observers regard as the final expression of the same self-serving, yet image-conscious impulse that defined his entire life. Mary Jane was 34, Zachary was 4, Sadie was 3, Madison was 2. If Christian Longo represents what happens when a man's entire identity collapses inward, the next case takes us into the forests south of Portland, where 8 women disappeared, and the man responsible walked among his neighbors for years without a single person suspecting a thing. Number 6. Dayton Leroy Rogers. A bow hunter walked into the woods outside Molalla, Oregon, on a September afternoon in 1987. He was looking for deer. What he found instead would stop the entire state cold. This story begins quietly, the way so many of the most disturbing ones do. Dayton Leroy Rogers was born on September 30th, 1953, in the small community of Canby, Oregon, in Clackamas County. He grew up in the kind of rural Pacific Northwest landscape that most people associate with timber, fishing, and long summer evenings. There was nothing about his early life that stood out to neighbors or teachers. Nothing, that is, except a pattern of behavior that first appeared when he was barely a teenager. At 16, records show, Rogers was already discharging firearms at moving vehicles. By 19, he had stabbed a 15-year-old girl in a confrontation. These incidents did not result in the kind of sustained intervention that might have altered what followed. Rogers moved into adulthood, married, had a child, and settled into life as a small engine mechanic in the Canby area. He ran his repair shop. He went home at the end of the day. He was, to all appearances, an ordinary man living an ordinary life in a quiet corner of Oregon. He was deeply in debt, chronically stressed, and living a secret life that bore no resemblance to the one his neighbors observed. Rogers had developed a pattern of picking up women, primarily those struggling with addiction, working as sex workers, or living on the margins, in Portland's streets and convincing them to get into his pickup truck. He would drive them south out of the city, away from streetlights and other people, into the forests and logging roads of Clackamas County. The women who got into that truck were selected, investigators would later conclude, precisely because they were vulnerable. Their disappearances were less likely to trigger immediate large-scale investigations. They were the kind of people the system had already left behind. The case cracked open not through the discovery of the forest dump site, but through a moment of extraordinary public visibility on a busy road. On August 7, 1987, a woman named Jennifer Lisa Smith was in Rogers' pickup truck in a parking lot off S.E. McLaughlin Boulevard in Oak Grove, in unincorporated Clackamas County. An altercation erupted inside the vehicle. Rogers stabbed Smith 11 times before she died at the scene. What Rogers did not account for was the presence of multiple witnesses in the surrounding area. Several people in the parking lot saw what was happening and immediately moved to block his truck with their own vehicles. Rogers drove directly over a landscape median and fled south at speeds approaching 100 miles per hour, through Milwaukee, Gladstone, Oregon City, and into Canby. One witness pursued him the entire way, took down the address when Rogers pulled into a driveway, located a telephone, and reported it all to police. Rogers was arrested within hours. He was connected to the Jennifer Smith killing quickly. But what investigators discovered next transformed the case entirely. While Rogers was in custody awaiting processing, a bow hunter in the Molalla Forest, a vast expanse of privately owned timberland roughly 20 miles south of Portland, came across what appeared to be human remains. He called police. What followed was one of the most grim search operations in Oregon law enforcement history. Within a 5-day period, investigators combing that section of forest found the remains of 6 more women, all within approximately 100 yards of one another. The site had been used repeatedly, all over a period of time, as a disposal location. The victims, whose identities investigators worked to establish over the following months, were women who had gone missing from Portland's streets. Several had been tied up. Forensic examination of the remains revealed evidence consistent with knife wounds. Some of the victims had suffered injuries to their extremities, including, in at least 4 cases, wounds indicating the feet had been severed. The press dubbed him Oregon's own Green River Killer. The comparison was not made lightly. The Molalla Forest site had the characteristics of a deliberately chosen, repeatedly used location. Not a crime of panic or impulse, but the work of someone who had planned this operation methodically across an extended period. All investigators built the forensic case against Rogers with remarkable precision, given the decomposed state of much of the evidence. The tool marks on bones found at the site were matched to a hacksaw recovered from Rogers' possession. Blood samples from his pickup truck matched multiple victims. Burned clothing remnants found in his wood stove were consistent with fabric from the victims' garments. Hairs collected from the truck were matched to several of the women found in the forest. And the physical evidence from the Smith killing, observed by witnesses in broad daylight, had already placed Rogers in custody. Rogers was convicted in 1988 for the murder of Jennifer Smith, and in May 1989 for the 6 Molalla Forest murders. The jury sentenced him to death. And then the legal saga began, one that would span more than 3 decades and test the patience of victims' families in ways no justice system should require. The Oregon Supreme Court overturned Rogers' death sentence in 1992, ruling that procedural errors had compromised the penalty phase. A new sentencing trial was held. The jury again imposed death. The Supreme Court overturned that sentence in 2000. Another sentencing trial. Death again. The Supreme Court vacated the sentence a 3rd time, in 2012. In November 2015, a Clackamas County jury sentenced Rogers to death for the 4th time. In November 2021, the Oregon Supreme Court overturned that sentence as well. this time citing a 2019 change to Oregon law that significantly narrowed the definition of aggravated murder, the only charge in the state that carries a capital sentence. Yes, the court ruled the change applied retroactively. Rogers was ordered resentenced by a lower court. Then, in December 2022, Governor Kate Brown commuted the death sentences of every inmate on Oregon's death row to life without the possibility of parole. Dayton Leroy Rogers, who was sentenced to death 4 separate times for the murders of at least 7 women, will now die in prison, but of old age. He is currently held at Two Rivers Correctional Institution in Umatilla, Oregon. He is 71 years old. The legal proceedings alone consume more than 30 years and are estimated to have cost Oregon over $3 million in appeals. The families of his victims attended sentencing hearings across 3 decades. They sat in courtrooms and watched the process begin again and again and again. They gave victim impact statements more times than any family should ever be asked to stand up and speak. In 2023, at what prosecutors hoped would be a final sentencing proceeding, several of those families faced the cameras and said simply, they just wanted it to be over. The forest outside Molalla is still there, the logging roads still run through it, and somewhere in those trees, investigators have always believed there may be an 8th victim whose identity has never been confirmed. If the Molalla Forest case is a story about how long justice can be delayed, the next case takes us somewhere very different. A rural Oregon highway, a state mechanic, and a string of disappearances that nobody connected for nearly 15 years. Number 7. John Arthur Ackroyd and Roger Dale Beck. She reported the attack within hours. She preserved the evidence. She described her attacker in precise detail. The police gave her a lie detector test. And when her results came back uncertain, they looked at Ackroyd's results, which came back clean, and they closed the file. He went on to kill for the next 15 years. That is where this story truly begins. Not with a discovery in the woods, not with a courtroom verdict, but with a young native Alaskan mother sitting in a police station in 1977, telling the truth about what had been done to her and being sent home without justice. That decision, that single institutional failure, set a trajectory that would claim the lives of at least 4 more people and haunt a stretch of Central Oregon highway for nearly half a century. John Arthur Ackroyd was born on October 3, 1949, in the small logging town of Sweet Home, in Oregon. By most descriptions, he was a loner from childhood, bullied in school, quietly isolated, a student in special education who enlisted in the Army after being accused of theft, and ended up working overseas as a mechanic before returning home with a discharge that included another theft charge. In 1977, he secured employment with the Oregon Department of Transportation, assigned to maintain roads along U.S. Highway 20, a 2-lane highway that threads east to west through some of Oregon's most remote and spectacular mountain terrain, passing through logging towns, resort communities, and long empty stretches where nobody would notice a truck pulled off at a trailhead. That same year, on a late spring evening in Sisters, Oregon, a 20-year-old woman named Marlene Gabrielson had gone out with her husband to watch a rodeo, her first night out since giving birth 3 months earlier. The couple had a disagreement, and Marlene found herself alone outside, looking for a way back to where they were staying. John Ackroyd offered her a ride. An hour into the journey, he pulled off Highway 20 onto a remote logging road. He held a knife to her neck. He dragged her into the trees. When it was over, he drove her to her mother-in-law's house in Lebanon. Whether out of some calculated decision or momentary restraint, investigators would never fully understand. Marlene did not go home. She went directly to the hospital, preserved every piece of evidence she could, and called the police. She described her attacker as a large, heavy-set man who worked outdoors. She gave them John Ackroyd's name. Both Marlene and Ackroyd took polygraph tests. She failed hers. He passed his. No charges were filed. Ackroyd returned to his truck, his highway routes, and his life. 14 months later, on Christmas Eve of 1978, Kay Turner went out for a morning run. Kay was 35 years old, from Eugene, Oregon. She and her husband Noel were spending the holidays with friends at a cabin in Camp Sherman, a quiet resort community tucked into the mountains of Jefferson County, right on the edge of Highway 20. She set out alone at around 8:30 in the morning for what was supposed to be an hour-long run along a camp road. By 10 o'clock, Noel was driving through the area, searching for her. By 2 in the afternoon, the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office had launched a formal search with bloodhounds, met volunteers, and aircraft. John Ackroyd was among the highway workers in the area that morning. He told investigators he had seen Turner on her run and spoken briefly with her. He said he had also picked up his friend Roger Dale Beck, a fellow hunter who lived nearby in Sisters, before continuing on. He reported nothing else. 8 months passed. Then, in August 1979, Aykroyd informed authorities that he had found Turner's remains in the woods, approximately half a mile off the road where she had been running. What he had not explained was why he had waited 8 months to come forward, or how he had known to look in that precise location. Investigators recovered bone fragments, scraps of her clothing, her running shoes, and her wristwatch. The remains were too scattered and degraded to immediately establish cause of death. And the case remained officially open, but functionally cold, and Aykroyd kept driving his routes along Highway 20. In the mid-1980s, he married a woman named Linda Pickle, who had 2 children from a prior relationship, a son named Byron and a daughter named Richanda. The family lived at Santiam Junction, a remote highway maintenance compound sitting at the intersection of Highway 20, Oregon Route 22, and Oregon Route 126. It was isolated country. There were few neighbors. Aykroyd was described by those who knew him as controlling and abusive toward both children. On July 10, 1990, 13-year-old Richanda Pickle disappeared from the family's home at Santiam Junction. Her brother Byron later told investigators that Richanda always left a note when she went anywhere. There was no note. John Aykroyd was the last person to see her. Then her body was never found. The disappearance of his own stepdaughter did what Kay Turner's death had not. It focused sustained investigative attention on Aykroyd in a way he could not deflect. Detectives from multiple jurisdictions began comparing notes. An investigator named Ron Benson, working out of the Lincoln County District Attorney's Office, started mapping the connections. Marlene Gabrielson in 1977, Kay Turner in 1978, Richanda Pickle in 1990, and 2 more cases that had emerged in the intervening years. In the spring of 1992, the bodies of 2 teenage girls, 17-year-old Melissa Sanders and 19-year-old Sheila Swanson, were discovered by hunters near an old logging spur off Highway 20. The girls had vanished the previous spring while hitchhiking home from a camping trip at Beverly Beach State Park. Bond investigators determined that Aykroyd had previously encountered the girls, offered them rides, and at one point invited them to a gathering near the same stretch of highway where their remains were found. He had been observed 3 separate times in the vicinity of where their bodies were later located. On June 12, 1992, police arrested Aykroyd at his workplace in Corvallis and simultaneously arrested Roger Dale Beck at his home in Porterville, California. Beck, the friend Aykroyd had mentioned picking up on the morning Kay Turner disappeared, had, according to his own ex-wife, Pam Ramirez, boasted to family members about killing a woman in the mountains. Ramirez came forward, and her testimony, combined with advanced forensic testing on the physical evidence from the Turner case, gave prosecutors the foundation they needed. The trial of John Arthur Aykroyd commenced in the Jefferson County Circuit Court on September 8, 1993. The prosecution charged him with 5 counts related to the murder of Kay Turner, multiple charges representing different legal theories of the killing, as the physical evidence, while compelling, was not complete. District Attorney Bill Hanlon would later tell reporters that Aykroyd had essentially been undone by his own attempt to collect reward money for finding Turner's remains. Had he stayed silent, Hanlon said, the case might never have moved forward. On October 5, 1993, the jury found Aykroyd guilty on all 5 counts. He was sentenced to 5 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. Beck's trial followed in the same courtroom. His ex-wife testified about the conversations she had overheard. And he was convicted on November 22, 1993, and sentenced to life in prison. But the story did not close there. In April 2013, nearly 23 years after Richanda Pickle vanished, Lynn County prosecutors charged Aykroyd with her murder, citing advances in DNA testing as the basis for renewed action. Aykroyd pleaded no contest and agreed to a deal that would ensure he died in prison without seeking parole for either case. The Lincoln County District Attorney's Office was simultaneously building a case against him for the murders of Melissa Sanders and Sheila Swanson. They never got the chance to bring it to trial. On December 30, 2016, John Arthur Aykroyd was found unresponsive in his cell at the Oregon State Penitentiary. He had died of natural causes. The case against him for Sanders and Swanson was closed, and Roger Dale Beck is still alive. He remains incarcerated at the Oregon State Penitentiary, where he has applied for parole multiple times and been rejected on each occasion. The board has consistently ruled that he has failed to accept responsibility for his crimes and has been promoting a conspiracy theory, placing blame on 6 other individuals for the murder of Kay Turner. As of the most recent available records, he remains behind bars. Richanda Pickle was never found. Her body has never been recovered. She was 13 years old. In 2018, the Oregonian published a landmark 5-part investigative documentary series called Ghosts of Highway 20, detailing Aykroyd's crimes and, critically, how a pattern of institutional disbelief, particularly toward Marlene Gabrielson, a native Alaskan woman whose rape report was dismissed in 1977, allowed one man to continue operating along that highway for nearly 2 decades. In 2023, Investigation Discovery brought the story to a national audience through a 3-part series narrated by Octavia Spencer. What Marlene Gabrielson tried to tell them in 1977 was true. All of it was true. And the women who came after her paid the price for a lie detector test and a closed file. The case that follows is different in almost every dimension, shorter, sharper, and with a very specific ending. It is the story of a man who asked the state of Oregon to hang him and got exactly what he asked for. Number 8, Wesley Allen Dodd. He did not ask for a lighter sentence. He did not ask for mercy. He stood before the court, looked the judge directly in the eye, and told them exactly what would happen if they let him live. They believed him. And on January 5, 1993, the state of Washington hanged him, the first legal hanging in the United States in nearly 30 years. He had asked for that too. Wesley Allen Dodd was born on July 3, 1961, in Toppenish, Washington, the oldest of 3 children in a household defined by conflict. His parents fought constantly and, by his own account, offered him little in the way of emotional support or stability. When they eventually divorced, something in Dodd, already fragile and poorly anchored, broke loose in a direction that would prove catastrophic. He began exposing himself to children in his neighborhood at the age of 13. By 14, he had moved to abusing younger cousins. He placed himself strategically in roles that provided access to children, babysitting, working as a camp counselor, taking jobs near schools. By the time he was 18 and seeking out victims he did not know personally, his pattern was already deeply entrenched. He joined the Navy and was stationed in Bangor, Washington, where he targeted children on the naval base and made trips to Seattle, approaching boys in movie theater restrooms. He was arrested. He was discharged. He entered counseling. He wrote in a 1991 court affidavit with alarming candor. Each time he entered treatment, he continued. He said he liked what he was doing and did what he had to do to avoid jail so he could keep doing it. By 1986, investigators would later estimate Dodd had sexually assaulted approximately 30 children. Despite multiple arrests, the most significant jail time he had served was 118 days. The system had processed him, assessed him, counseled him, and released him over and over, without ever meaningfully interrupting what he was doing. A charge that could have resulted in years of incarceration was reduced to a gross misdemeanor. He went home with probation. In 1989, Dodd moved to Vancouver, Washington, a city directly across the Columbia River from Portland, Oregon. He was 27 years old. He had a job at a paper plant. And in the late summer of that year, his fantasies crossed a threshold from which there was no return. On September 4th, 1989, he drove to David Douglas Park in Vancouver with a fish fillet knife and shoelaces. He encountered 2 brothers playing together, Cole Neer, 11 years old, and William Neer, 10. He lured them to a secluded area of the park, bound them, and committed acts against them before stabbing both boys and fleeing. Cole died at the scene. William died on the way to the hospital. Dodd went home, collected newspaper clippings about the murders, and started a scrapbook. He would later say in the flat, detached language that characterized everything he said about his crimes that he had found more satisfaction in killing than in what had come before. He began constructing plans and building a homemade torture device in his apartment for what he intended to do next. On October 29, 1989, Dodd drove to Portland, Oregon. At Richmond Elementary School, he found 4-year-old Lee Izelli playing alone on a slide while his 9-year-old brother Justin played elsewhere. Dodd told Lee that he wanted to take him somewhere to play games. Lee went with him. He took the boy back to his Vancouver apartment. That evening, he drove Lee to McDonald's and to Kmart. It's where he bought him a toy. Then he returned to the apartment. Much later that night, after Lee had fallen asleep, Dodd woke the boy and told him what he intended to do in the morning. Lee Iselli was 4 years old. The next morning, Dodd carried out what he had said. He disposed of Lee's body near Vancouver Lake, placing it in trash bags that he left in nearby bushes. Lee's clothing was burned in a trash barrel. One item was kept as a souvenir. The following day, Lee's body was found by a passerby, triggering a search across Clark County and into Portland. Dodd stayed in his apartment, kept his head down, and spent the days writing in his diary, detailed entries planning future abductions, describing future victims, mapping out what he intended to do to each of them. He built a torture rack. He waited. On November 13th, 1989, just 2 weeks after the Iselli murder, Dodd drove to the New Liberty Theater in Camas, Washington, about 12 miles east of Vancouver. He went into the men's restroom, where he found 6-year-old James Kirk alone. He grabbed the boy and attempted to carry him out through the lobby. James Kirk fought. He screamed. He struggled. He did not stop resisting. Dodd forced his way into the lobby with the boy in his arms, attracting immediate attention from theater employees and patrons. He pushed outside and ran toward his car, but the vehicle would not start. A passerby named William Graves, the boyfriend of James's mother, came outside to investigate the commotion. Graves assessed the situation, pretended to be a helpful stranger, offered to assist with the car, and then put Dodd in a headlock and held him until police arrived. Yes, Dodd was taken to the Camas police station. Detectives from the Portland task force investigating the Seeley murder were contacted and drove across the river. Within 1 hour of questioning, after detectives mentioned that his workplace was less than a mile from where Lee's body had been found, Dodd confessed to everything. The Neer brothers, Lee Seeley. He told them all of it. When investigators searched his apartment, they found the diary, the scrapbook of newspaper clippings, the torture rack, the photographs, the shoelaces. Every piece of what he had been planning was documented in his own handwriting in extraordinary detail. Dodd was charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of attempted kidnapping. His attorney advised him to plead not guilty. Dodd fired his attorney, changed his plea to guilty on all counts, and told the court he wanted to die. His reasoning was explicit and unambiguous. He stated under oath that if he were ever to escape from prison, or if he were ever released, he would kill again. He said he would kill prison guards if that was what it took to escape. He said the only way to guarantee that he never harmed another child was to execute him. He requested that the method be hanging. Specifically, he said, because that was how Lee Seeley had died, and he did not deserve an easier death than his victim. Washington State had lethal injection available as its primary method of execution, but inmates could choose the alternative, the gallows. Dodd chose the gallows. He was sentenced to death. He waived all automatic appeals, every single one. The process that for others consumed decades took less than 4 years from arrest to execution. On the night of January 4th and into the early minutes of January 5th, 1993, Wesley Allen Dodd was walked to the execution chamber at Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla. The technique had not been used in so long that the execution team consulted an Army manual from the 1880s as their procedural guide. Members of the Neer and Seeley families were present as witnesses. Members of the press were present. Outside in the snow, demonstrators for and against the death penalty stood in the cold. Just before the hood and noose were placed over his head, Dodd spoke his final words. He said he had once been asked whether sex offenders could ever be stopped. He had said no. He said he was wrong about that. He said he had found hope. He found peace in Jesus Christ. He told those listening to look to the Lord. The trap door opened. Witnesses reported no sign of struggle. Wesley Allen Dodd was 31 years old. He had sexually assaulted an estimated 175 children across 15 years of sustained criminal activity, with multiple arrests, multiple periods of counseling, and multiple releases. 3 children died in the final 10 weeks of his freedom. His case directly contributed to the passage of the Community Protection Act of 1990 in Washington State, the first sexually violent predator law in the United States, which authorized the indefinite civil commitment of individuals deemed to pose a continuing danger after serving their prison sentences. It was a law designed, in part, to prevent the system from making the same mistake it had made with Wesley Dodd again and again for 15 years. The next case has none of the drama of a courtroom moment or an execution day. It is quieter than that, and in some ways more sinister. A man hiding in plain sight in Hillsboro, Oregon, telling neighbors he was something he was not, while the women of his community began to disappear. Number 9, Caesar Barone. He had 2 names. The first was the one his father gave him. The second was the one he chose for himself. After walking out of a Florida prison, where he had spent years living next to the most notorious serial killer in American history, he chose the new name deliberately. And then he moved to Oregon and started killing. Adolph James Rode was born on December 4th, 1960, in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, the youngest child in a modest household in the city's southwest section. His mother left when he was young, and he was raised by his father, Adolph Sr., and a stepmother named Stella Hall. By the accounts of those who knew him as a child, there was no documented history of physical abuse in the home. His father worked. His stepmother kept the house. Neighbors remembered the family as quiet and unremarkable. What they remembered about young Jimmy, as the neighborhood called him, was something else entirely. He stole from the time he was old enough to walk into a store. He was expelled from kindergarten. As he grew, he threatened other children with knives. He terrorized younger kids on the block. He skipped school and used drugs and broke into homes for cigarettes and money. At 15, he forced his way into the home of a neighbor, a woman named Alice Stock, a retired schoolteacher who lived across the street, and attacked her at knife point. He was placed in a juvenile facility for 2 months. His record was handled as a juvenile matter and carried no lasting legal consequence. The attacks on women continued into adulthood with accelerating severity. In the early 1980s, he was arrested for an alleged attempt to rob and choke his own grandmother, who was 70 years old. She identified him as her attacker and suffered significant injuries. The jury acquitted him due to complications with her testimony. He was subsequently convicted of an unrelated burglary and sent to prison in Florida in 1981. Prison did not rehabilitate Adolph Rode. It introduced him to someone. In 1986, after a failed escape attempt and an assault on a corrections officer, Rode was transferred to the Florida State Prison in Stark, one of the most secure facilities in the state. It was there that he was housed in proximity to Ted Bundy, the man who had confessed to the murders of dozens of women across multiple states and was sitting on death row awaiting execution. Records indicate that Rode and Bundy were housed next to each other on 2 separate occasions, once for approximately 2 months and once for 12 days. Rode was, by the accounts of other inmates and later investigators, openly thrilled by this proximity. He boasted about it constantly. He told anyone who would listen that he had a relationship with Bundy. The investigators who later worked the Oregon homicide cases suspected that Rode had approached Bundy for specific knowledge, asking in essence how Bundy had been caught and what mistakes he had made. Whether or not Bundy answered those questions directly, something else emerged from that period. A singles newspaper that Bundy reportedly passed to Rode, which Rode used to respond to a personal advertisement. The woman who placed that advertisement became his wife. He was released in 1987, and he gave himself a new identity. The name Adolph James Rode disappeared. In its place, Cesar Francesco Barone. Whether he legally changed the name or simply adopted it as an alias, the effect was the same. He arrived in the Pacific Northwest as a different person on paper. He joined the Army briefly, but was discharged in 1990 after being accused of exposing himself to a female officer, and after the military discovered the full extent of his prior criminal record. By then, he had already settled in the Hillsboro, Oregon area, a quiet suburban community in Washington County, west of Portland. He worked occasionally as a cabinet maker. He briefly held a position as a nursing assistant at a care facility in Forest Grove, a job that gave him access to elderly and vulnerable women. He attended church. He was, to the community around him, simply a man who had moved to town and was getting on with his life. His first known victim in Oregon was 61-year-old Margaret Helen Schmidt. In April 1991, Barone broke into her home on Southeast Walnut Street in Hillsboro, attacked her, and strangled her to death. But he took money from the premises before leaving. Her body was discovered by a social worker several days later. Robbery was initially listed as the probable motive, and the case did not immediately generate a suspect. Barone continued. Over the following months, investigators would later piece together that he was also responsible for attacks on at least 3 other women in Washington County who survived. Assaults that were not initially connected to one another or to the Schmidt homicide. Then, in October of 1992, Hillsboro residents began calling 911. Multiple callers reported a woman's body lying in the middle of a road on Northeast 231st Avenue. The victim was 41-year-old Martha Browning Bryant, a nurse midwife who had been driving home from a late work shift. Records indicate that Barone had followed her vehicle on Cornell Road, pulled up behind her car, and opened fire with a 9mm handgun, striking her in the shoulder and forcing her off the road. He then got out of his vehicle, dragged her into his car, drove approximately 1/3 of a mile, shot her in the head, and left her body where it fell. She was rushed by life flight helicopter to a hospital in Portland and pronounced dead early the morning. The murder of Martha Bryant, a respected member of the healthcare community, killed on a public road in the middle of the night, galvanized Washington County law enforcement. A task force was formed. Investigators began reviewing unsolved cases across the region and found threads that, when pulled, led back to the same address. Approximately 3 months after the Bryant murder, in January 1993, the body of 23-year-old Shantae Woodman was found along a roadside near Vernonia, Oregon. And as investigators dug deeper into the pattern of attacks in Washington County, they began building a picture of a man who had operated methodically, selecting victims across a wide age range, and who had taken deliberate steps, drawing perhaps on lessons absorbed during his years in Florida, to avoid leaving obvious signatures. The arrest came through the accumulation of evidence rather than a single breakthrough moment. Investigators matched Barone to the crime scenes through physical evidence, forensic analysis, and witness accounts. He was taken into custody, and the full scope of his history began to emerge. The Florida record, the juvenile attacks, the name change, the Bundy connection. and the pattern of burglaries and assaults against women going back to his teenage years in Fort Lauderdale. Florida authorities reopened the 1979 murder of Alice Stock, the retired schoolteacher who had lived across the street from Rhode as a child, and whom he had attacked at 15. The evidence, now viewed in context of everything else, pointed directly at him. His trials moved through the Washington County courts across 1994 and 1995. In December 1994, he was sentenced to death for the murder of Martha Bryant. 2 subsequent trials returned death sentences for the killings of Chantay Woodman and Margaret Schmidt. For the death of a 4th victim, 62-year-old Betty Williams, a nurse who was attacked in her home, he received a sentence of 89 years, multiple death sentences. A criminal record stretching back to kindergarten, a new identity built on the ashes of an old one, and a connection to Ted Bundy that investigators believed was not merely a coincidence of incarceration, but a deliberate apprenticeship. Cesar Baroni never faced execution. In the late 2000s, while housed at the Oregon State Penitentiary, he was diagnosed with a cancerous tumor on his heart. On December 24, 2009, he died in prison. He was 49 years old. He had never admitted responsibility for any of the murders. He had never expressed remorse. The name Adolph James Rhode died with him, as it had effectively died in 1987 when he walked out of a Florida prison, chose a new name, and drove northwest toward a community that had no reason to fear him yet. And if this case belongs to a past that is fully closed, the final story in this series is very much still open. A Portland neighborhood, a string of unsolved disappearances, and a trial not yet begun. Number 10, Jesse Lee Calhoun. This case is not finished. The trial has not happened. The full evidence has not been made public. And as of today, at least one family is still waiting to find out whether the man they believe killed their daughter will ever be charged for it. This is the only story in this series that has no ending yet. And that fact alone makes it unlike everything that came before it. Jesse Lee Calhoun was born on March 19, 1985, in Portland, Oregon. The details of his early life that have emerged through court proceedings paints a picture of a man who moved through the justice system repeatedly. Not as someone who fell through the cracks, but as someone the system repeatedly caught, processed, and released, each time failing to account for what he might do next. His criminal history in Multnomah County is extensive. Convictions for burglary, vehicle theft, assault on a law enforcement officer, attempting to strangle a police dog, a detail that recurs in coverage of his case and strikes most observers as both bizarre and telling. In 2019, he was convicted in Multnomah County Circuit Court on felony charges of burglary and car theft and sentenced to 50 months in prison. His projected release date was June 2022. He did not serve his full term. In 2021, and then Governor Kate Brown signed commutation orders for 41 inmates who had participated in Oregon's prison wildfire firefighting program during the catastrophic 2020 Labor Day fires, some of the most destructive wildfires in state history. Jesse Lee Calhoun was among those inmates. His sentence was reduced by approximately 1 year. On July 22, 2021, he walked out of the Columbia River Correctional Institution, more than a year ahead of schedule. What followed over the next 18 months would raise questions that Oregon's political and law enforcement communities are still grappling with today. Records show that after his release, Calhoun violated the conditions of his supervised release on multiple occasions. Each violation was documented. Each violation, according to reporting by The Oregonian, and failed to result in reincarceration. He remained free, reporting to his probation officer as required, while investigators would later allege he was simultaneously committing murders. The first body was found on February 19, 2023. Kristen Smith, 22 years old, had been reported missing from Gresham on December 22, 2022. Her remains were discovered in a wooded area in southeast Portland. Partial remains found in a field in the Pleasant Valley neighborhood. Prosecutors would later allege that she had been killed on or around November 20, 2022, meaning she died while Calhoun was still under supervision and subject to check-ins with authorities. Then, in the span of just over 7 weeks in the spring of 2023, 4 more women were found dead in locations spread across a roughly 100-mile radius of the Portland metro area. Now, Joanna Speaks, 32, was found on April 8, 2023, inside an abandoned barn in Ridgefield, Washington, just across the Columbia River from Portland. The Clark County medical examiner determined she had died from blunt force injuries to the head and neck. Court documents allege she was killed on or around March 18, 2023, and her body moved afterward. Charity Lynn Perry, 24, was found on April 24, 2023, in a culvert near Ainsworth State Park in East Multnomah County. Records indicate she was killed on or around March 8, 2023. She was found more than 6 weeks after her death. Bridget Leanne Webster, 31, a resident of Milwaukee, was found on April 30th, 2023, on Harmony Road near Mill Creek in Polk County. Court documents allege she was killed on April 26th, and her body moved the same day. And then, in May 2023, the body of 22-year-old Ashley Real was found in a heavily wooded area in Eagle Creek, Clackamas County, approximately a month after she had been reported missing to Portland police. Her father, Jose Real, told reporters that Ashley had identified Calhoun as the man who had attacked and choked her in November 2022, and that police had not arrested him at that time. She had been too afraid to cooperate fully with investigators. 4 months later, she was gone. When the bodies began surfacing in the spring of 2023, families of the victims immediately told reporters and law enforcement what they believed, that the cases were connected and that a single predator was responsible. The Portland Police Bureau issued a statement in June 2023 saying it had no reason to believe the 6 deaths were linked. A month later, yet the Multnomah County District Attorney's Office reversed course and announced that investigators had established connections between 4 of the cases and had identified a person of interest. Media outlets identified that person as Jesse Lee Calhoun, though authorities did not confirm the name publicly. On June 6, 2023, Calhoun was arrested, not on murder charges, but on unrelated parole violations. He was returned to prison to serve the remaining months of his original sentence. Governor Tina Kotek, responding to a request from prosecutors, revoked the commutation that had led to his early release in 2021. The race to build a prosecutable case began. Prosecutors at the Multnomah County District Attorney's Office worked against the clock. Calhoun was due for release on June 7, 2024, and without indictment, he would walk free again. On May 16, 2024, just weeks before that deadline, a Multnomah County grand jury indicted Jesse Lee Calhoun on 3 counts of second-degree murder and 3 counts of second-degree abuse of a corpse for the deaths of Charity Lynn Perry, Bridget Leanne Webster, and Joanna Speaks. He was transferred to Multnomah County Jail and arraigned on June 6, 2024. He pleaded not guilty to all charges. The indictment did not include Kristen Smith. Her mother, Melissa Smith, attended the arraignment wearing a shirt bearing her daughter's name. She later told reporters that standing in that courtroom, watching 3 families take a step toward answers while her own family was left waiting, was among the most painful experiences of her life. On August 5, 2025, Multnomah County District Attorney Nathan Vasquez stood before cameras and announced that a grand jury had now indicted Calhoun for the murder of Kristen Smith as well. The charge, second-degree murder and second-degree abuse of a corpse. Melissa Smith stood at that press conference and said she had prayed for this day every single day since her daughter's remains were found. She said she had never given up hope. Diana Allen, the mother of Charity Perry, addressed Calhoun directly from the podium. She told him he was no longer the smartest person in the room. Maybe the day of the crime he was, but not anymore. As of today, April 2026, Jesse Lee Calhoun remains in custody at Multnomah County Jail. His trial is scheduled for 2027. He has pleaded not guilty to all 4 murder charges. Today's prosecutors have shared almost no details about the evidence underlying the charges, citing the ongoing and active nature of the investigation. The death of Ashley Real, 22 years old, whose father said she had already told police that Calhoun had attacked her months before she disappeared, remains under investigation in Clackamas County. No charges have been filed in her death. Her family is still waiting. There are, as of this writing, 5 families, 4 indictments, 1 trial date, and 1 woman whose case remains officially open, while the man her father named as her attacker sits in a Portland jail pleading innocent to 4 other murders. This case began in a city still reeling from years of upheaval. It unfolded in plain sight, bodies found within miles of one another, the families shouting from the beginning that the deaths were connected, a suspect with a documented violent history who had been released early and failed supervision requirements while allegedly continuing to kill. The questions it raises about the justice system, about who gets protected, who gets believed, and what happens when the machinery of accountability moves too slowly, are questions that will be answered, at least in part, in a Portland courtroom in 2027. This series began with a trucker who drove across America and taunted the police with smiley faces. It ends with a case that hasn't ended, with families who are still standing at press conferences, still wearing their daughters' names on their shirts, still telling anyone who will listen, do not give up hope.